This is possibly, I'm going to win the prize for the most amateurish PowerPoint. It's sort of irrelevant, but I threw it together like in 5 minutes just in case you want to look at some statues of Donald Trump. These were taken, most of these were taken in rural central Pennsylvania, where I go for a bike ride and then stop and take a picture of the local Trump statues. I'm not actually going to be talking about Donald Trump statues, but I am going to be talking about what causes this horrible disease that I encounter in an otherwise beautiful green space. 2020 was the year in which the politics of statues reached fever pitch, coinciding with the efflorescence of the Black Lives Matter protests that in turn coincided with the widely viewed public lynching of George Floyd by law enforcement. Statues became the object of political activism. There were clear and simple cases, such as the removal of, now I hope I'm going to get this direction of my PowerPoint, no, wrong direction. Huh. Technical assist. Oh, so if you keep going, right. That's me. They're irrelevant anyway. There were clear and simple cases such as the removal of, let's see if I can get it right this time and not be too trigger happy. Hey. Okay, I'll just keep going. They were clear and simple, and you can see how I'm that PowerPoint person that I write statues and PowerPoint suggests this image, and I'm like, why not? There were clear and simple cases such as the removal of Confederate statues, which were ex post facto valorizations of anti-blackness, so it became a common observation in the mainstream press that the statues that were, the Confederate statues, I'll leave it with that one, that's an interesting case. The Confederate statues that were removed were not erected after the Civil War, but much later when there was an attempt to romanticise the Civil War by white supremacists. So removing them wasn't really removing the past, but an interpretation of the past. So those were clear cases, just removing Confederate statues. And then there were slightly more complicated instances, such as Edinburgh University renaming David Hume Tower, even if the city of Edinburgh retained the statue of David Hume that it erected in front of the High Court in 1995, and which this is research, Edinburgh tourism tells you that if you touch the philosopher's toe, it's good luck. That's a myth, or even though it generates from 1995. So it's one of these tourist things like kissing the Blarney Stone, which is totally authentic. In June 2020, the statue of Philadelphia abolitionist Matthias Baldwin was defaced with the words murderer and coloniser. So this is where I started to get interested in it. There was just such an attack on statues that abolitionist statues were defaced, and then this was taken up by the right-wing media, like these left-wing idiots, they're just attacking statues, they're not being discriminate. This guy was an abolitionist. Although he had been instrumental in schooling black children, and so saying he was a coloniser was possibly not all that inaccurate. In the same month of June 2020, the statue of another abolitionist, John Greenleaf Whittier, was painted with BLM and fuck slave owner graffiti. So he's an abolitionist, and then people put BLM, and this was seen to be an own goal for the Black Lives Matter movement. Like, they're just destroying everything, they've got no respect. They're even destroying abolitionist statues. So this statue of John Greenleaf, then another statue of an abolitionist, Hans Christian Heg, was torn down. Originally from Norway, Heg was an abolitionist activist who died fighting for the unions. So he was on the right side of history, supposedly, and yet his statue was defaced. In July 2020, a 2018 statue of, now this is one that's interesting. This was a statue of Frederick Douglass that was vandalised, although no words were painted to identify motives. The statue was removed and then replaced with the aid of two men who in 2018 had damaged another Frederick Douglass statue. They just were destroying statues, right? So they're destroying the statue of Frederick Douglass, it gets removed, and then they're on some prison reparation scheme, and they are crucial in restoring the statue. But I'm going to leave this because this is a image. I'm going to leave it for two reasons. One, I can't be bothered negotiating the technology of PowerPoint, and two, removal of statues, and this is Frederick Douglass. So it would seem to be, in this case of statue confusion, we need to know more about statues. Which ones are good and which ones are evil? The BBC provided a helpful summary of the statues being defaced, concluding with Winston Churchill and why this statue is marked as racist. So the BBC did this helpful guide. This statue was defaced. It was Winston Churchill, quoting Winston Churchill, quoting David Hume, showing which ones were abolitionists. With a chastising tone, the public intellectual, I won't call him a philosopher, even though that's what he calls himself, Julian Baggini remonstrated with the moral grandstanding of statue defacers. Don't criticise philosopher David Hume for racism until you look in the mirror. That's his quote. That's a quotation from Baggini. This timely advice suggests that statues cannot be that easily passed into simple cases of good versus evil, partly because Hume said things, this is according to Baggini, that were worth remembering, but also because given the context in which Hume was writing, his racism was, quote, marginal and not part and parcel of his system. So the idea is you could go through Hume, mark off the racist bits, keep the good bits, keep the statue, keep the building, so forth. His racist remarks supposedly do not destroy the ongoing value of his philosophical contribution. And if, here's the crucial thing, here's the question Julian Baggini asks. It's the question asked every day on Fox News. If you start removing statues of Thomas Jefferson, where's it going to end? Right? Like, everyone is guilty. There's no statues left. And I'm like, at least Fox News gets it. Right? There's nothing left. I think Tucker Carlson probably has read some Bataille. Although Tucker Carlson turned out to be too right-wing for Fox News. So again, he's obviously read his Bataille. The argument that the anti-statue sentiment has gone too far and that there might be nothing left has been one foil in the conservative resistance to removing statues. More nuanced arguments defending statues include allowing us to live with our mistakes rather than washing history away. Like, you've got to keep them there because that's our history. You keep the statues of the enslavers there, that's our past. Now, that's the claim, it's our past. My claim is that what statues do is take what is our present and pretend it's the past. The tearing it down of statues did not begin in 2020. Brief histories, so The Guardian, the BBC, MSNBC, CNN, but not Fox News, had these helpful guides to the statue destruction, showing that they're a frequent event in revolutionary fervour. No one mentioned the tearing down of Saddam Hussein's statue that was so celebratory in the liberation of Kuwait. That's too uncomfortable to talk about that form of removal of statuary, i.e. the colonising removing of statuary. There's bits of this talk, like many bits of this talk, I'm editing out. One bit that I'm not going to read, although I advise you to read it, is President Trump's former President Trump's executive order of June 26, 2020, which is an executive order against removing statues. And just because reading or listening to anything Trump says is hilarious in and of its own accord, and I'm going to remove that humour by summarising it, but he starts by saying these extremists, they've gone too far, you know, they've started with Ulysses S. Grant in San Francisco, they're removing Confederate statues, and he says, what's next? The Holy Family? Are we going to remove statues of Mother Mary and baby Jesus? That's the end of the executive order. I might, that many existing religious depictions of Jesus and the Holy Family should be purged from our places of worship. That's where the extremists want to take us. The removal of statues of baby Jesus. Now again, just as I think Fox has got it on the money when they say if you start removing statues, there's nowhere to stop, I think Trump's right that if you want to go that far, you've probably got to get rid of your Christmas nativity scenes. Why? Because where I'm going with this is statues are Oedipal. They're Oedipal, and maybe you can see that with the Trump statues I had earlier. And they create or endorse or assemble with a form of Oedipal time. So what I want to explore here is a way through what might appear to be an exclusive disjunction and move towards an inclusive disjunction. Rather than asking whether destroying statues is good or evil, should we keep them as a reminder of the past? Should we wash them away? Which ones do we remove? Or asking which statues are good and which are evil, it might be better to assume that destroying one statue does lead towards the destruction of them all. That's claim number one. Tearing down statues does erase history, like it has this destructive, corrosive effect, and that tearing down statues has the effect of creating history. And, crucially, that tearing down one statue is a moment of creation. So I think this is actually a really cool monument now. Even though it's the removal of Frederick Douglass, I think that's probably a better monument to an abolitionist than a statue of his body. He's not here to answer for that, even though President Trump referred to him as a good friend, I think, or still alive, right? So, apart from embracing the inclusive disjunction and trying to pull the problem apart, ideas which I take from Anti-Oedipus, what makes the problem or the attempt to recompose the problem of statues a perfectly Deleuze-Guattarian endeavour is hinted at in President Trump's warning that Jesus and the Holy Family might be next. If you listen to these abolitionists, the next thing is the Holy Family. Statues are bound up with an Oedipal history and with an Oedipal temporality. One of the left-wing or supposed left-wing observations that was often reiterated in 2020 was that even though some Confederate statues were erected to mourn the Confederate dead from the 1860s to the 1880s, most Confederate statues emerged in the Jim Crow era. So they're statues of the past that are actually reconfiguring the past. They were not markers of time, but ways of shaping time. Statues were, to some extent, already events of defacement. So here's my claim: all statues deface time. All forms of statuary destroy the outcome of revolutionary events, and they're all events of defacement. Statues, however much they might be tied to a 19th century aesthetic of the great men of empire and the increasing privatisation of history, with the erasure of the collective complexity of history and the simple punctual model of time as a series of intentional actions heading inevitably toward the present, are necessarily events of defacement and have a history that is best encountered through a history of the state that is also a history of desire. So statues, insofar as they put a proper name and an organised body as a marker of history, are obviously, I think, privatisations of history, taking the complex and collective events of history, giving them a proper name and a single body. Statue time is state time, and state time is edible time. A philosophy beyond the state cannot be a simply post-humanist philosophy, but needs to reckon with the edible history of defacement that is integral to the state. So I see the history of statues and monuments as a history of the state and a history of the defacement of time and collectivity. Recall that for Deleuze and Guattari, one of the first moves of their anti-Oedipal account of history is that the figure of the father, is a contraction of collective forms, and that the contraction of the despot into the father was coterminous with colonisation. The substitution of a single body and face occludes or defaces the complex process by which states had always been warded off. So the state is not something, I mean, this we all know because we're card-carrying Deleuzians. The state is not something towards which history is inevitably tending. The state is something you constantly have to fight off, and you fight that off through not allowing the coagulation of power into the figure of the father. And that fight against the state collapses with privatisation and Oedipalisation. Despite their celebration of great authors of the European tradition, there is in Deleuze and Guattari a theory of the monument neither as stored memory nor as the expression of spirit, but as the release of forces of expression from expressive matters. So that sentence I just read, I might, even though I promised myself I wouldn't, go on a tangent about that. In the longer version of this paper, I compare their theory of monuments with Hegel and Stiegler. So I'm going to allow myself one sentence on each. So for Hegel, and it's just going to be a long sentence, when he looks at classic statuaries, like the Greeks have got the idea of universality, that the universal is human, they haven't actually made it properly abstract. They're giving it a human body. But at least for Hegel, the statue is the human and not like Donald Trump or Frederick Douglass. So it's like it's hinting towards universality. It gives the universal a bodily form, but it's not fully abstract into philosophical concepts. That's Hegel's notion. And so if you're a good Hegelian, which I think all good Deleuzians ultimately are, you can see the regression of statuary, like it became more and more personal, more and more privatised, less universal, such that now we have, statues to Donald Trump. I'm too scared to. Dare I? No, I'm back to my generic PowerPoint. So, okay, let's go through that. That's the defacement. There's David Hume. Let's just do Winston Churchill. Okay, let's just leave it at that. So we've regressed, right? We've gone from classical statuary to the Statue of David, which nearly got a teacher expelled in Florida because she showed her kids a picture of the Statue of David, and so she was showing her kids porn, to this, right? So it looks like we've regressed somewhat. Hegel, statues are a hint at the universal that haven't fully arrived. Stiegler, monuments are stored memories. They're ways of us carrying the past into the future, and I'm setting Deleuze and Guattari against that with their theory of the monument, which am I going to press the... That's Hegel, Let's just have that. That's my quotation from Deleuze and Guattari. Before going on to make a case for why their specific theory of the monument is salutary for debates regarding the removal of statues, primarily because they enable a space beyond the current moral terrain of good and evil, I want to compare their philosophy of the monument to two other possibilities from which we might think of as the continental tradition. In the case of this specific problem, I also want to suggest that something about continental philosophy is salient when thinking about 21st century moralising. I know the distinction between analytical and continental philosophy is sort of useless and gatekeeping, but I've recently begun to think it's worth revisiting precisely because it goes beyond good and evil into a theory about the formation of time. So when Hegel discusses statues, he's primarily concerned with the history of reason, but more importantly, the relationship between spirit and matter. And I take that to be the contribution of continental philosophy, that who we are is a relationship between spirit and matter. That is historical and the point at which revolution can begin, rethinking spirit and matter. So Greek statuary, according to Hegel, not only gave concrete form to the abstract, which is the task of the history of reason, to give form to itself and recognise itself, it also marks, at least for Hegel, for us, a moment when the universal might take on an immediately human incarnation. So I take the problem of continental philosophy, whether you're Derrida or Stiegler or Deleuze or Husserl, to be how spirit takes on incarnation or takes on matter. I wasn't able to attend Dan Smith's talk last night, but of course I got the copy of the talk and read it alone in my hotel room, which is the great way to experience a conference. Just ask people for their papers and go back and read them on your own. But it is this notion of how thinking relates to matters and the relationship between materiality and thinking and the artifactual nature of thinking. I think even Derrida, writing is not something you add on to give thought form. Thought takes the form or comes into being through writing. Within Deleuze and Guattari's work, despite their manifest anti-Hegelianism, there remains the force of this Hegelian problematic. Art realises the expressive power of matters. If Hegel thought that it was necessary to pass beyond art to philosophy so that reason might recognise itself through concepts in a manner more refined than statuary, so Deleuze and Guattari will insist that modernism's grasp of expressive matters goes beyond reason recognising itself to the capacity of the artist to set apart the forces from which any lived world is composed. If I could go back to that, which I won't even try, that image of the erased Frederick Douglass statue, that strikes me as a Deleuze and Guattarian statue, like you've pulled it apart to see its moment of composition. If statues for Hegel were ways in which the universal was apprehended, they were nevertheless, for Hegel, too bound to the organic. The point, though, was that the worthiness of statues was their capacity to bring the universal into temporal apprehension and not to isolate a human subject or mark a moment within time. So this is me being a grumpy little old lady saying, you know, things were better back in the 18th century when we knew that statues ought to be universal and not personal. The statue would be an expression in the particular of what could be thought of by any reasoning subject whatever. This is why Hegel can write an aesthetics valuing and devaluing various forms to the extent to which they accede to the universal. It's also why Hegel then becomes very racist and colonialist in looking at other cultures other than the European that are still making statues of gods and so forth. There can be no such thing as pure thought thinking itself in a godlike manner without that mediation through substances, matters, forms. Thought is necessarily historical and necessarily monumental, or I could say, following Dan Smith's talk that I didn't attend, artifactual. This is not history as a series with one thing simply occurring after another, nor is it a history as something like a history of ideas where one understands a work according to its context. History is not necessary in the manner of Hegel, where each stage is a necessary step towards reason recognising and overcoming itself, finding better and better material forms. But history grapples with expressive matters and negotiates the relationship between the lived, or the formation of monuments, and the forces that bring those monuments into being. So to sum up this stage of the argument, what Deleuze and Guattari and Hegel share, isn't that a great, what they all share, Deleuze, Guattari, Hegel, those happy bedfellows, is a sense of the artwork's immanent historicity. So even when Deleuze looks at Francis Bacon, it's the struggle on the canvas is the struggle with the history of art, really Hegelian notion. For Hegel, the task of art will eventually be to give way the materiality and become philosophy. And of course, for Deleuze and Guattari, it's somewhat the opposite, for philosophy to recognise its place in matters and the incarnation of matters. For Deleuze and Guattari, the task will be to intuit the force that brings matters into being, as if thought could then somehow vanquish itself and become imperceptible, could recognise the forces that bring it into being. So, just checking on the time. This is where Deleuze and Guattari might help dislodge the supposed debate, it's not really a debate, about statues, which ones we keep, which ones we destroy, or between free expression, you know, the right to keep your statues, or the right to remove statues because they hurt your feelings. That's a false debate there, it's an exclusive disjunction. That either or presupposes the non-violence of thought, either assuming that one can keep a monument or text as a form of free expression, or achieve some moment where all expression is without harm. There's no such thing as simply keeping a statue as the mark of a past that is past. It's just a statue, get over it. There's no such thing as simply raising a question or simply quoting a text. But by the same token, there's also no such thing as erasing or purifying the terrain of speech and art of violence. That goes back to my first point. You want to remove all the statues that deface or violate the past, you remove the entire archive. And maybe that's not a bad thing. If Hegel thinks of the statue or of art and philosophy more generally as the externalisation of spirit in its journey towards self-recognition, this is because for Hegel, spirit is nothing more than the time of recognition. The journey through history is the journey through matter and statuary for spirit to recognise itself as that which gave form to itself. As I've already suggested, this conception of reason as a journey towards universal recognition allows all the objects of history, statues, philosophical texts, everything else, to become the means through which we might examine and overcome our less than rational past. What might it mean to take the incarnation of spirit not as a medium, but as the bringing into being of the human? So that's where I take Deleuze and Guattari's project to be. What are the matters and events through which the human comes into being? So this is where I would differ, put a minus sign in front of new materialism and you get Deleuze, meaning it's not that the human can just go back to materiality and wallow around as if it's in a nice materiality bath or swamp. It's the opposite. It's to intuit in materiality what gave birth to this monstrous thing called the human. And you can't just say, oh, that was a mistake, let's go back to the bath, swamp of materiality. It's however expressive matters given birth to this thing called the human, and that includes all the texts of philosophy, all the archival objects. How has the body of the present come into being through technical objects, and that would include smartphones, PowerPoints, however crude, industrialised image production, and social media platforms. These are the archival objects that bring us into being. This means that art is not an object within time. Statues and monuments are not objects within time, but the ways in which time is realised, both recognised and brought into being. If we took this seriously, and I guess we take everything seriously because it's a Deleuze and Guattari conference, if we took this seriously, it would shift the problem away from judging statues within time, asking whether they're good or evil, and instead see statues and monuments as the incarnation of time. And in the case of the statues I'm looking at, Confederate statues, imperial statues, I think it's, do I need much explanation to say it's a form of Oedipal time in which there are the great fathers of history that created time, right? Even if it's, whether it's a Trump statue, a David Hume statue, obviously they're not equivalent. I'd rather read, okay. It would be better to think of the different ways in which the composition of things is also the composition of our being as time. In Difference and Repetition, Deleuze takes issue with Freud's distinction between the pleasure principle and the reality principle against a Freudian thermodynamics where pleasure's aim is the dissipation of energy that must negotiate the objects of this world. Deleuze argues for a passive synthesis where selves are formed from excitations and then the extension and organisation of those selves in relation to objects that are both real and virtual. So his example, like you all know this, but I love this one. His example of a child who's learning to read and the book is upside down. Why do I like that example? There's one photograph of me as a child in kindergarten and I'm holding a book, right? And the book is upside down. And it's like, I'm imitating you wanting me to read. We're reading always with an other, right? One is the objects towards which we move are always partial objects, object equals X. One of the more significant implications of Deleuze's account of passive and active synthesis and where he differs from Kant is that passive synthesis is not simply perception but production, forming the selves we happen to be. Active synthesis is the orientation of these passive selves in relation to an object that is both actual and virtual. We read a book that is both the material object in one's hands and the sense that is given as those others who have read before me. We walk as an organised body, but we walk towards a world that is populated by actual and virtual objects. There's a great paragraph in Eileen Morton Robinson's book about walking through a city in Australia and seeing every building is a reminder that this is white colonised space, right? So that that's an object, like just walking through a city produces you as a certain type of subject. Okay, the title of the talk was Readymades and the Readymade. This is where I actually get onto that, and it's also the conclusion. If you look throughout, let's just start and end with what is philosophy. There's two uses of ready-made. One is concepts are not ready-made, right? The philosopher creates concepts. And so there's an argument against concepts as ready-made. Like, if I want to be a good philosopher, I have to find what justice is really, and that means getting a really good understanding of the concept, as though concepts are ready-made, right? Like if I want to be a good philosopher, I've got to work out what justice really is. By contrast, no, Deleuze is no, their concepts are not ready-made. You're a philosopher if you actually create a concept of justice, right? And they create a concept of the monument. Almost the opposite is the ready-made, right? Which is like the Duchamp, take an everyday object, put it in an art gallery, and you've deformed it, transformed time. The objects we encounter are ready-mades in the sense given to this term by modernism. In What is Philosophy, Deleuze and Guattari are insistent on the role of production. But production is not creation ex nihilo. You don't like have a blank canvas and canvas. Blank canvas. That's just me thinking about next semester, and that's a wish fulfillment. A blank canvas in which you create. We create through ready-mades. The canvas is populated by cliches, and what you have to do is take them, mutate them, transform them, put them somewhere else. If we take the elements we encounter and allow our bodies as perceptual machines to form new configurations, then we have discovered what will eventually be known as art, which is neither copying a world that exists already, nor creating some imagined compensatory idea of the world to make up for the paucity of existence, nor executing an idea. A ready-made, as opposed to concepts that are ready-made. A ready-made sets things apart, pulls them apart, allowing them to form new relations released from function. Rather than placing an object within its context, so this is me like really being pissed off with literary studies, you know, put things back in their context. If you put Hume back in his context, he wasn't that racist really, because everyone was racist back then, you know. As though context might operate as a frame from which we are set apart. Like, put things back in their context. No, tear them out of their context, right? Read them out of context, out of sync. Like, what would it mean for someone who's not trained in the history of philosophy to read David Hume? And then if someone says, well, that's what my undergraduates do all the time and it's horrible, they're not reading out of context. They're reading in the context of Wikipedia, right? They've got too much context. Hume was a Scottish philosopher. It was a part of the Enlightenment, right? Like, humans have always told stories. You know, that's too much context, right? Tear it out of... Humans have always told. The 18th century was a period of great change. Like, no, context, not stop with the context. For Deleuze and Guattari and What is Philosophy, the setting apart of qualities or the rendering monumental of forces, take them out of their time, that compose the everyday. It's at once timeless, but also profoundly historical. Obviously not historical in the sense of a series, but historical in the sense of understanding the composition of the present. For all their anti-Hegelianism, or at least Deleuze's supposed anti-Hegelianism, What is Philosophy, like Difference and Repetition and 1,000 Plateaus, depicts the philosophy of immanence as a struggle that takes on the formations of the past. So the struggle of immanence is the struggle of not erasing the past, but somehow tearing the past apart, pulling things out of context, like get rid of context. Concepts and art objects do not appear ready-made, but their creation is an event akin to the ready-made, taking up the terrain before us, redistributing its elements, forming forces beyond function. And if what art really is can only appear at the end, that's what they say. Right? It's very Hegelian. You only understand what art was all along. You only understand animals moving things about as a form of art once you've got to modernism. If we can recognise the stage maker, the bird, as the first ready-made, this is because modernism could finally liberate art from expressing the artist or the earth and allow matters themselves to appear as expressive. So yes, they are, like all the French dudes of their time, overly attached to high modernism. So they keep within the tradition, but, you know, doesn't mean we have to be faithful to that bit. So this brings us back to, I'm going to start concluding. I said that 10 minutes ago, this was the conclusion, but it's a long conclusion. So this brings us back to statues and, oh, this is a terrible phrase, I can't believe I wrote this, and moving beyond the right and left. That's like, why can't we all get along? I like to think of myself as somewhere, but no, neither right, well, you know what I mean, neither the right or left, which are basically the right. I've already mentioned the different modality of history in Deleuze and Guattari, which is not a series of different contexts within which one might locate objects and events. From anti-Oedipus onwards, the problem of history is privatisation, i.e. putting things in their context, taking David Hume, putting him back in his context, and then acting like, well, he had those ideas because of who he was and where he lived. That's privatisation. No, you have to take him out of his context, then look at all the concepts as an assemblage. They fit together. You can't go through text and like get a highlighter pen. Oh, that's the feminist bit. Oh, that's the patriarchal bit. Oh, I like this bit. That's the universal bit. That's, and like put it into its context. It's pull it apart and see how pull it apart, then see how it goes together. So the problem of history is privatisation, not simply taking, and by that I mean not simply taking the Oedipal subject and intuing it as a geopolitical event, which it is, right? The valorisation of the nuclear family such that every nativity scene has mummy, daddy and baby Jesus. God, I'm going to go to hell. Just having a bet both ways there, just in case, right? Not simply taking the Oedipal subject and intuiting as a geopolitical event, but also not allowing history to be ours, giving it statuary forms that return it to private individuals with intentions, whether good, bad, or not. Philosophers' names. So I see the destruction of statuary as in accord with what Deleuze does in Difference and Repetition, where philosophers' names stand for ways in which thought struggles to think. So look at a philosopher and look at it as a struggle. The proper name stands for a struggle with matters of thinking, always captured too readily by images of itself as ready-made, not as the ready-made, as ready-made. Philosophy is a struggle with things that are ready-made as opposed to the ready-made, pulling things apart. Concepts appear as ready-made rather than as the outcome of an event of the ready-made, right? What you should really be doing, and there is a should, there's an imperative, is seeing the things before you when you're writing as things you have to tear apart, take them out of their context. In the case of ready-made concepts, we know exactly who we are and how to think and align the world with our frame of reference. We encounter the past as having its frame of reference and grant other cultures the same horizon of ownness. To think, this is my last sentence, so to think in terms of the art of the ready-made is to allow thought to become transfigured by the elements it encounters. Thank you.